a game called 5 Goals and 5 Ways. Now, there's various different adaptations of this, and a number of you on the call may have played this or played an adaptation of this. But essentially, we're going to play a game. Could be 5v5, could be 6v6, could be 10v10, depends on how many players you have. But for this game to have real success, I would always suggest fewer players on the pitch. So there's more opportunities to have shots at goal, to defend goal, to have touches on the ball. So if you've got lots of players in training, you might have 2 of these pitches. If you've got fewer players, you might put them all on 1 pitch. But essentially what we would do is just play a game of football. We're trying to score it in their goal. They're trying to score it in our goal. But the scoring system's going to have a slightly different flavour. Rather than every time you score, it's worth 1, we're going to have 5 different ways of scoring. And if you score in those 5 different ways, you tick them off the checklist. So just in the chat now, coaches, give me some suggestions if you were going to play this game of ways that you might ask your players to score within this type of game. So for example, I might say, can you score off a first time finish? That might be one of the ways. Brilliant. So we've got volley coming through, and we've got left foot, first time finish, lots of coming through now, a number of passes before you score, weaker foot, hit the crossbar. Amazing. So it's up to you. You can be as creative as you want with this. And there's 2 kind of key options that I would suggest. The first one is that your players could choose. So they could come up with the 5 ways, but I would suggest that you manage that, because I've tried this with 7 and 8-year-olds, and the 5 ways that they come up with are always really interesting. There's always a 7-year-old who wants to score with a bicycle kick, and this game would take 5 days if we allow that. So we might need to manage it. The other thing that I would ask you to consider as coaches is the 5 different ways that you require them to score. Are they going to increase player engagement and player fun, or are they going to reduce player engagement and player fun? So for example, I've seen a couple come through about 5 or 10 passes before you score. Will that help your players engage with the practice more, or will that take their fun away? Now, it's not for me to say that there's a simple answer to that, because it might depend on how good your players are, how big you make the space, and how many players you have on the pitch. If you say 10 passes before you score, and that's an impossible task, I would say that's going to reduce their engagement because they can't achieve it. If that's a challenging task for them and they like it, I would say go for it. That would work. But whichever way you come up with, I would urge you as coaches to think, are they going to like this, or is this going to be something they're not going to like? And let's pick 5 ways that they will like. So for example, I might pick first time finish, because then we can get rebounds off the post, off the goalkeeper. We can get lots of creative play. I might do something about taking a player on before scoring, because players like that. They like being skillful. I might do something about passing, but it will probably be, can you make 2 passes in the attacking half rather than a large number? I might do something around every single player scoring, for example. Or I might do something around scoring from a particular part of the pitch, not necessarily halfway line or further back, but maybe a slightly further out goal. And then what we would do is when there's a goal, rather than me as the coach ticking that off, I would ask the player who scored to come off the pitch and tick that off. And that would create a 5 or 10 second gap where the team that have just conceded have an overload, and they might be able to get one back, and they might be able to try and score. So that's essentially the game. Have a think about how your players might engage with that practice. Have a think about the types of goals that you might ask them to score. And essentially, when the game's over, the beauty of the game is if it's over quickly, we can just wipe our whiteboard down and come up with a new 5 ways of scoring and restart the game. And if the game's taken ages, we can cut it down to 3 goals or 2 goals if we need to. So there's lots of ways that we can use this game to fill up some time or to reduce time. But what we won't have is our players saying, this is really boring, because they're playing a game of football which is competitive with some rules with their friends. Gaz, I'm going to hand over to you, if that's okay, just to talk through potential ways of adapting practices.
Question for the coaches: how might we start to change the shape of that pitch then, or the space within how that game's played? What might you do as coaches to change the shape or the size of that pitch in order to challenge players further or engage your players? What could you do with that pitch area, do you think? Good, so you could widen it. It could be a really wide pitch, so you could make it a little bit wider, but maybe a bit narrower, so we could get more goals potentially. Brilliant. We've got more goals that might be going on the sides of the pitch, so we could add in more goals. decrease the space if you wanted to challenge it. So again, Lee talked about maybe playing games in this particular format with maybe less players on the pitch. So you could change it to having 2 pitches maybe, and have maybe a 3v3 with 2 goalkeepers, and have another pitch which has got a 3v3 pitch as well. Brilliant. You're really starting to think about how you can apply this framework to the particular game that we've showed you. One of the ways I might do that, particularly as it's a finishing session, is I might start to funnel the pitch off a little bit. What I mean by that is I might start to, well, that line is really thick, so I'm going to shorten that a little bit. We might start to think about cutting off the corners of the pitch and making it a little bit more like a diamond shape. So if you look at the pitch now, you can see that the pitch is funneled off towards the goals. So it might force the ball towards goals, the goals that are on the pitch, and start to create more goal scoring opportunities. We could potentially put a little middle section in as well, which could be where the ball starts from. So players might break out from the middle of the pitch, and we could have effectively thirds across the pitch where players play through the thirds. So I'm just trying to show you that you can be really creative with the types of spaces that we use, the shapes of the pitch that we use, and how big and how small you can use in terms of your areas to challenge players appropriately. Lee talked about the 5 different ways that we score. Effectively, they are different tasks. They're tasks that we provide our players in terms of how we score goals. Lots of you have talked about equipment, so we could add in additional goals. You could have 4 goals in this particular game, and you might put them maybe in the corners of the pitch. So, for instance, instead of having the goals in the centre at either end, you could have 2 target goals on each corner, 2 at that end and 2 in that end. So we're using more goals to give more opportunity to score lots of goals, and also to stop goals being scored as well. And then lastly, question for you as coaches. If I was on the blue team and I started to play this game, but I recognised really quickly that my team is losing 5, 6, 7, 8-0, what would you do as a coach in order to change that? So what might you do in order to change that challenge and make it maybe slightly easier for some players in order to help them with their engagement with the activity? Good. So we might start to mix the teams up or change the teams around, swap players over. One brilliant comment I've just seen come through is about overloading. So what you might be able to do is to add more players to one team and have less players on another team. For example, it could be a 3v2. And we see lots of that in the game, don't we? Lots of counter-attacking opportunities where players find themselves, 3 players are attacking the pitch against 2 defenders. So you could create lots of overloads or underloads. You could swap the players around. Ultimately, in order to get that balance right, you need to understand your players. You need to understand their challenges, their strengths, their challenges that they find difficult on the pitch, and be able to group your players effectively that allow practices and activities to be really engaging for your players. And that's the P in the STEP framework. So just to recap, we're thinking about using that STEP framework to engage our players in the different activities that we can use. We can look at the space and the size and the shape of the area. We can provide different tasks for the players. And Lee's given some great examples of different goals, for example, that we could score and the ways that we could score goals. We could use different bits of equipment, flat discs to mark out different sections of the pitch, bigger or smaller target goals, more goals, for example. But ultimately, as a coach, we're there for the players, and we need to understand those players and meet their needs in order to make a session really engaging. So I guess my challenge to you is, after tonight's webinar, and when you go back into that environment, and I'm pretty confident Lee will ask me for a challenge towards the end of this webinar as well, but I'll try and set it now for you. I'd love you to go away when you go back into your coaching environments, is to try and think about how you can adapt your practices using that STEP framework.